In my opening remarks, I want to start by emphasizing the universality of the positions that I am setting out in my book, and universality in two senses. So the book itself focuses in particular on hate speech, and it also contains a lot of references to First Amendment law, the portion of the American Constitution that contains a guarantee of free speech. But the message is really transcendent in two dimensions. Number one, hate speech is just one example of the kinds of controversial speech that is constantly targeted for censorship, both by government and by powerful private sector actors, including the pressures of civil society through what we call cancel culture in my country, and also through the giant tech platforms. And the speech that is targeted tends to be targeted all around the world. In my recent experience, the most controversial kinds of speech that are regularly attacked are disinformation or misinformation, extremist speech or terrorist speech, and hate speech. And often those terms are used interchangeably or overlappingly. So let me give you a very concrete example from the United States. I'm sure many of you followed with curiosity and perhaps dismay the shocking events of January 6th, 2021 in the United States, when we saw an insurrection and mayhem and physical violence right in the heart of the capital of our democratic republic. And as often happens when there is an physical assault on individuals, on property, a threat to national security, to democratic order, many people point the blame at expression, looking for a scapegoat, if you will, or a supposedly significant contributing factor. And so, not surprisingly, in the wake of those events, there have been increased calls for punishing all three categories that I have referred to, and demonizing the expression by Donald Trump and other political leaders who were giving speeches both on January 6th itself and the run-up to January 6th as hate speech, because it allegedly included allegations against various minority groups, extremist and terrorist speech because it was threatening the democratic order, and also disinformation and misinformation about the election and the alleged stealing of the election, including to those who, from the perspective of those who were supporting the insurrection. So we've seen increasing calls for social media companies and even government to crack down on all three kinds of controversial expression. And the reasons that I explicate in my book for opposing censorship of hate speech, those same reasons apply to opposing censorship of these other controversial kinds of speech as well. So that's one general way in which the points I make are universal. They go beyond hate speech to other controversial kinds of speech. The second way in which the analysis is universal is that it transcends the principles that are now enshrined in First Amendment law. And I say now because for most of the history of the First Amendment, which was ratified in 1791, we had no meaningful protection of free speech in the United States. The words were written on pieces of paper, but in practical reality, government was violating them every day with the support of the United States Supreme Court. And it was not until the second half of the 20th century, well into the third century of the existence of the First Amendment, that the Supreme Court really started to seriously enforce that free speech guarantee. And the principles that are reflected in the Supreme Court's modern, current speech protective interpretation are principles that are also reflected in international human rights law under the major United Nations treaties that govern freedom of speech, including hate speech. This is a point that is not nearly as well known as it should be, and it's a point that I feel it's really important to emphasize, because the critics of strong speech protection often point to American law and say, oh, it's American exceptionalism, it's off the charts, it's completely out of keeping with the rest of the world. And in fact, that's not true. Well, for one thing, there are many Americans who disagree with strong free speech protection, right? But there are also many human rights advocates all over the world, in countries all over the world, in international human rights agencies, in regional human rights agencies, who support the very same strong free speech protective principles as are now protected under First Amendment and United Nations law. So, there are debates within every country, but I think it's really important to not pit this as the United States against the rest of the world. It's a speech protective set of principles that has meaningful support all over the world, as well as opposition all over the world, and very meaningful support in the UN law. And that international dimension is especially important as we're now talking about the major platforms for the exchange of information and ideas being these giant global tech companies, which are not going to be adhering all over the world to the law of a particular country. For all practical purposes, if we want to have meaningful free speech that's honored by these powerful companies, the norms that make the most sense and are strategically the most appealing to them are the international norms. So here, let me just add one more word on that, and if people want to discuss it in more detail, I would welcome follow-up questions or comments. But in 2018, an American law professor named David Kaye, who was then the special rapporteur for freedom of expression at the United Nations, wrote a very influential, extremely well-reasoned report in which he, number one, explained how the recent interpretations of the United Nations free speech treaties. There are two major ones, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, ICCPR and ICERD. Even though the strong free speech guarantee in the ICCPR contains an exception for hate speech, and even though the ICERD even requires signatory countries to outlaw hate speech, David pointed out that those provisions have been interpreted very strictly and very narrowly to only allow governments to restrict hate speech consistent with the same speech protective principles that are also reflected in American law. So those are my two introductory points about why I hope you will take general universal significance from the comments that happen to focus in particular by way of illustration on hate speech and American law. So I have had this wonderful experience of the last few days of engaging with many individuals and many audiences here, and I want to take into account as I decide how, what remarks I'm going to make to you in the opening, the most common questions that I have already received as I've been speaking with your fellow citizens in the Czech Republic. And one question that I've been getting over and over, and I get it in the United States and other countries as well, is where did this passion for free speech come from? Why do I care so strongly about free speech? And I think the answer is really important because I am primarily a human rights activist, and that's how I've been spending the bulk of my entire adult lifetime. As Adam mentioned in his kind introduction, I, for almost 20 years, was the national leader of the largest and oldest civil liberties organization in the United States and in the world, the American Civil Liberties Union, whose mandate has always been to defend all fundamental freedoms for all people. We believe that no matter who you are and no matter what you believe, you are entitled to certain fundamental freedoms. And note that we're not called the American Constitutional Law Union. We're the American Civil Liberties Union. So yes, the Constitution can sometimes provide a tool, a resource, an instrument that we can use to advance civil liberties, but the two are not coextensive. So our concept of fundamental freedoms goes beyond what the Supreme Court happens to have interpreted as being protected by the United States Constitution. So a universal mission from the beginning, when the ACLU was founded, the United States Supreme Court had basically not interpreted the U.S. Constitution as protecting equality rights or free speech rights at all. And I am passionately committed as a result, partly of my own family experiences. I understand how fragile respect for human rights and indeed human life is, especially when I'm here in Europe. I have to say my father was born in Berlin in 1922 under the pernicious Nuremberg laws that came into effect when he was a teenager. He was defined as a Jew of the second degree. His father was what was called an Aryan under those laws, and his mother was a Jew. He hadn't been raised Jewishly, religiously, but that was beside the point. For that reason, and because I'm so proud, even as a teenager, he was politically active against Hitler, he was sent to the Buchenwald forced labor camp. And like many survivors of the Holocaust, he never really talked about it, and I learned a lot of the story only after he died in 1999. And one thing that I only recently came to realize was that, forced labor, we talk a lot in my country about our legacy of slavery of Africans, but it's astonishing to me that my own father was performing slave labor, and that the Nazis had a program of not only killing, my father was doubly undesirable, right, because he was a Jew and he was a political opponent, not only killing through gas, but also through the slave labor. Now, you can understand my father did not want me to learn German, so I apologize for my horrific accent, but the motto they used was Zerstörung durch Arbeit, so killing through work. And it was literally another way of killing people more slowly. My father did almost die through malnutrition, disease, exhaustion, physical cruelty. And the clincher is this. The Nazis, in addition to having a program of genocide, had a program of eugenocide. And my father, as a double undesirable, literally had a date for his scheduled sterilization. And one day before the date when he was going to be sterilized, Buchenwald was liberated by American troops. So I literally owe my life as well as my liberty to the American military, and I could not have a deeper loathing of Nazism and fascism. I could not have a deeper commitment to equality and dignity for everybody, regardless of religion, race, and so forth. So I don't prize free speech above equality and the goals that are asserted by those who advocate censoring hate speech. You can't have one without the other. And I keep coming back to defense of free speech, including, indeed, especially for hateful and hated speech, because the more I consider it and the more I examine it, the more convinced I am that robust free speech is the absolutely essential prerequisite for every human right, including equality. Indeed, freedom of speech is the absolute prerequisite for any cause we want to advocate. I was recently reading an article written by a colleague of mine who founded a wonderful human rights think tank and civil society organization in Denmark called Justitia, and he wrote an op-ed about some current free speech controversies, and here's what he said in his own words, from his own investigations, making the same conclusion that I have, but probably much more eloquently than I did. He said, "Free speech may very well be the most empowering engine of equality ever invented by humankind." The most empowering engine of equality. Now, one point that I have to make that's not very well known is that those of us who strongly defend free speech, and I include not only myself as an individual, the American Civil Liberties Union as an organization, the United States Supreme Court as an institution, at least since the 1960s, we are often called free speech absolutists. And that is quite misleading, because none of us absolutely, categorically, completely, and always support free speech. No freedom is absolute, but a fundamentally important freedom, including freedom of speech, is presumptively protected, right? To overcome that presumption in favor of protection, the government or whoever the regulator is has an appropriately heavy burden of proof, and it is one that is reflected in American modern law, in United Nations recent law, and I would submit is completely consistent with common sense. It is often referred to by shorthand as the emergency principle, that speech may be restricted if, but only if, the speech directly, imminently threatens certain specific, serious harm. And no measure short of restricting the speech is going to suffice to avert that potential harm or emergency, if you will. If you look at the United Nations treaties that I mentioned, the central free speech provision in the ICCPR, which, by the way, almost every single country in the world is a party to it, including your country and my country, the term that's used there to capture this idea is necessity the necessity principle and the concept of least restrictive alternative is also expressly used in the UN law as well as it is in the United States law. So yeah, if it's necessary to restrict speech, to avert, great harm to an individual, imminent violence, to protect great harm to national security, yeah, then government may restrict the speech. But if it's not necessary, if there's another measure you could take that would be as effective, that would not cause as much damage to free speech, then that less restrictive alternative has to be used. And when you think about that, that's just a matter of common sense, right? We might be willing to give up a little liberty to gain some security or some safety, some other public good, but why in the world should we give up liberty for not getting that benefit in response? And one point that I like to make is that these speech protective principles do outlaw the speech that is the most dangerous because it's got that direct and imminent causal connection to specific harm. The United States Supreme Court has recognized several subcategories of speech that satisfy the emergency principle. Let me just mention a couple of them. One I've already alluded to because it's come up in the context of January 6th, and that is intentional incitement of imminent lawless or violent conduct when the violence or lawless conduct is likely to happen imminently. Another example is what is often called a true threat or a genuine threat. And that adjective is used to signify that this is a more specific and narrow concept than the way we tend to use the word threat in everyday speech. I tell you, on college campuses, students will say, I feel threatened by the fact that Donald Trump is giving a speech somewhere nearby. That would not be enough to justify suppression. But when the speaker is targeting a particular individual or small group of individuals and intends to instill a reasonable fear that they are going to be subject to attack, and reasonable means in an objective sense, not in a subjective sense. So it can't just be that somebody happens to be particularly thin-skinned. And note that a threat is punishable as a true threat, even if the speaker doesn't intend to actually carry out the harm, because if you, as the targeted person, reasonably feel fear that you will be subject to harm, that's already causing specific damage to you, right? It's going to chill your free speech rights, your freedom of movement. And another example is targeted harassment or bullying, which is pervasive and persistent speech that, again, is targeted at an individual and directly undermines equality of opportunity in important spheres. And so speech that has a hateful content or any other kind of controversial message may, in particular facts and circumstances, satisfy the emergency principle, these subcategories of the emergency principle, and be subject to punishment. Let me mention one other really important concept that exists in United States law. I know it exists in the law of some other countries, and I'm sorry, I don't know if this is true in your country, but it's something that is usually referred to as a hate crime. I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I prefer to think of it as a bias crime or a discriminatory crime. And that is when an act is independently illegal, independent of any thought associated with it, say an assault on a person or vandalism of property. In our system, I think for the past 25 years or so, if the perpetrator intentionally singles out the victim for a discriminatory reason, then this can be treated as a more serious crime on the rationale that it does more harm not only to the individual but to overall society, and it can be subject to increased punishment. Now, very often, very often, the way to prove the discriminatory selection of a victim is through expression by the perpetrator, calling out some racist insult or some homophobic insult or Islamophobic, you name it, in the process of committing the act. So that's another way in which speech that is integrally interconnected with actual harmful, violent conduct can indeed be punished. So the most dangerous speech can be and is outlawed even in a speech protective regime. Correspondingly, though, the censorship that is the most dangerous is also outlawed. And this brings me to the corresponding core principle in both the American system and the United Nations system, and one that I think has universal applicability and force. And it's usually referred to as the viewpoint neutrality principle or the content neutrality principle, that government may never punish speech or censor speech solely because of its content, its viewpoint, its message, or idea. No matter how reviled and unpopular that idea might be, amidst no matter how large a segment of the public, that alone is never a justification for suppressing it. And the Supreme Court in the United States has said that this is the bedrock principle underlying freedom of speech, not only in terms of the liberty value reflected in free speech, but also in terms of its intimate interconnection with democracy, right? In a democratic republic, we, the people, are the sovereigns. We wield sovereign power. We elect government officials who are accountable to us. How can we possibly responsibly, meaningfully exercise that power if those we elect to be accountable to us are the ones who are taking certain controverted viewpoints out of the public discussion, right? It's James Madison, the chief author of the architect of he's often called the father of the Constitution, as well as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that included the First Amendment free speech guarantee. And he said, in our democratic republic, the censorial power is in the people over the government, not in the government over the people. And one of my favorite phrases from a more recent Supreme Court decision was the court was talking about speech about public issues, about matters of public concern, about matters of public policy, are not just a matter of self-expression. Rather, the court said that kind of speech is the essence of self-government. So if the government were allowed to engage in viewpoint-based discrimination, therefore manipulating the public discourse, it is at once deeply violative of not only individual liberty, but also of democratic self-government. So that's why the viewpoint neutrality principle means that the most dangerous form of censorship is outlawed. When I speak to audiences in the United States, especially of younger people, I feel it's really important to point out some of the history. I'm not sure how well known that is, even among a highly educated and informed audience. So I think it's really important to point out that the historic pattern in my country shows the same correlation between government power to censor and what the impact is on human rights that we see in other countries. And let me just get to the bottom line, which is that no matter how well intended the censorship might be, in the case of hate speech laws intended to promote equality, dignity, diversity, inclusivity, all goals that I passionately share, and yet the pattern consistently is that those laws are at best ineffective in promoting the goals, the shared goals, and at worst counterproductive. And that is not, and we saw that same pattern in the United States. I already alluded to the fact that it wasn't until the 1960s that the United States Supreme Court started strongly protecting free speech, including for hateful speech. Many of you know that the 1960s was the apogee of the civil rights movement in the United States against racial apartheid, the oppressive system of Jim Crow and deprivation of voting rights and other fundamental rights for Black Americans. And that overlap was no coincidence. It's also no coincidence that all of the great leaders of the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King Jr., fiercely supported free speech and strongly opposed censorship, including of hate speech, because the censorial tool in the hands of majoritarian governments that were opposed to the civil rights cause were not surprisingly wielding these tools precisely to suppress the advocacy of civil rights and also to suppress members of the national media who were really instrumental in conveying the civil rights message to other parts of the country and developing support for it. So, by the way, I'm using the term censorship to refer to any restriction of hate speech or other controversial speech that goes beyond the emergency principle. So I just want to remind you that I'm not absolutely opposed to government restrictions. The restrictions have to satisfy the emergency principle. Beyond that, for shorthand, I'll refer to it as censorship. So I tried to the very best of my human abilities to be open-minded as I approached writing this book in 2016 and 2017, looking at the patterns of enforcement of hate speech laws in countries around the world, looking at the documentation and the reports that were done by human rights advocates all over the world and in international agencies. And to the best of my human ability, if I were persuaded that an added restriction above and beyond what is permitted under the emergency principle, that it would be necessary and the least restrictive alternative to bring about further equality, to reduce hatred more, I would have been all in favor of it. More importantly, if you could present that kind of evidence to the United States Supreme Court, it would also uphold that restriction. And what was really striking to me and surprising was how many human rights advocates from all over the world, whom I quote in my book, reached the conclusion that censorship should not be pursued, that at best it was not helpful in dealing with the serious problems, including throughout Europe, of discrimination and violence against various minority groups, including Jews and Roma and refugees. And their opposition was not at all based in the law of their countries, which allow what I would call censorship of hate speech in non-emergency situations, but their opposition was based on the negative impact, including the disproportionate but predictable enforcement against members of minority groups. I don't want to talk too much longer, right? Because we don't have too much time. I'm looking for guidance here, so maybe I should just speak for 3 more minutes and cover whatever else you want to cover. Is that okay, Gabrielle? In response to questions. So, on the negative side, and I'm an activist, and that means I'm an optimist. So picture this as the glass half full. No matter how much is in there, it's the glass half full. On the one hand, I was really discouraged by the record on censorship. I would have welcomed evidence that it would be effective in reducing hatred, which, after all, is my main purpose, is to resist that. So that was the bad news. But the good news was a surprisingly encouraging evidence about how potent other mechanisms can be, including strictly written and strictly enforced anti-discrimination laws, including laws against discriminatory violence. By the way, coming back to the Holocaust example, I some ways this goes without saying, but I really want to say it. I absolutely would have supported censorship of the Nazis if that would have averted what happened to my father and to too many others who suffered even worse at their hands. But as historians have documented, and the Jewish community at the time attested to, there were strict anti-hate speech laws in the Weimar Republic that were strictly enforced, and the problem was that, number one, the Nazis used these as propaganda platforms to get the increased attention and sympathy that unwittingly is handed to them that by those who are trying to suppress the message through censorship, right, sadly and ironically end up amplifying the message. And the other point is that the Nazis were getting away with murder and with violence, and so we certainly have to strictly enforce laws against discriminatory or any kind of violence. And then finally, I'll end with something that often sounds rather weak: counter speech. And some critics will say, but that's only words. Well, yeah, but hate speech is only words, and you acknowledge the power of hate speech. So correspondingly, there is enormous power in counter speech. And by that, I mean not only in the narrow sense of somebody says something hateful and you respond to it and counter it. No, I mean it in a much broader sense of all of us constantly, proactively, affirmatively using our free speech rights strategically and creatively to propagate the positive messages of equality and tolerance and diversity and so forth, or in the context of disinformation, promoting critical media literacy and the ability to help people, enable people to withstand the potential negative impact of all speech. I, in general, think that prohibition strategies, whether it's of drugs or of words, are just not going to work because you're never going to completely dry up the supply, right? Even the most authoritarian regime can't do that. So we have to focus on the demand side and reduce people's demand for these pernicious ideas or their susceptibility to the disinformation or the hateful speech. And here there is so much really creative, intriguing research. As we were walking over here, we ran into one of Adam's friends. The whole city is filled with his friends and fans. And this particular one is an expert in artificial intelligence. And so I recently participated in a conference at Cambridge University that brought together data scientists and computer scientists, other social and natural STEM field people who are doing really serious and exciting research using the resources of the internet to develop and explore and assess what are the most effective counter-speech responses that can be used in particular situations, taking advantage of artificial intelligence and algorithms. So now I'm past my 3-minute self-imposed limit, so I'm just going to end by thanking all of you for your obvious interest in free speech, and thanking you for doing everything within your power to exercise your rights of counter speech to retard hatred and to promote equality and human rights. Thank you very much. So now you are going to exercise your free speech rights. Martin, thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you for this very interesting, well, lecture speech, whatever it was, and it was certainly free. I wanted to ask what's your take and what's your position towards the, let's say, European, but it's not only European, laws and legislation targeting media and social media outlets such as Facebook, etc., and asking them to delete hateful content once it's posted, that they should target it and delete it, I don't know, within a certain time frame. Do you think this is a correct procedure, or is it completely contrary to what you've been saying?
I think you can guess my answer, and in the paperback edition of my book, and I think it's included in the Czech, it is included in the Czech translation as well. I have an entire epilogue that focuses specifically on social media and uses the NetzDG law in Germany as a prime example of showing that the very same flaws with censorship of hate speech by government mar censorship of hate speech by any other entity or individual. Dare I say, Martin, if I pronounced you czar of the internet, then you could decide what speech is hate speech or not. It's the same problem. It's an inherently subjective concept that is irreducibly vague. I have read with great respect and interest every anti-hate speech law in the world, every proposed law, every definition under the community standards of every social media company. And paradoxically, sort of the more complicated they get, the more vague and subjective they become. And so it's not surprising that you see situations. Let me just give you one example, and I assure you it's completely characteristic. There was a Canadian case, and Canada has a typical anti-hate speech law, very similar to the laws in European countries, and it involved a devout Christian who believed that gay sexuality was sinful and was going to damn people to hell. So first of all, from his perspective, it was loving speech to try to recruit people away from gay sexuality because he thought he was saving their eternal souls. But, you know, put that aside, he distributed 4 pamphlets with messages about basically save your soul, repent of gay sexuality, sexual orientation. And it went through 3 levels of the Canadian court. And the first level found that all 4 pamphlets were hate speech. The second one found that 2 of the pamphlets were hate speech and 2 were not. And the third level found that all 4 of them were not hate speech. So, you know, these were people who are learned in the law, have studied and thought carefully about it. One person's hate speech, you know, in the case of this really illustrates it. He thought it was the opposite of hate speech. And so when you have these powerful companies exercising that degree of discretion, it's really very, very dangerous. And if you look at what is actually taken down as hate speech, it's very disturbing because it's often expression that is critical of certain government policies or advocating government policies in areas such as immigration, reproductive freedom, treatment of transgender individuals. I mean, really important public policy issues, and to, in effect, do what government is not allowed to do to skew the public debate when this is where the public debate is happening is very troubling. Now, let me, if I can, add on to that, Martin, and hook it up to a theme I was talking about, the idea of applying international human rights standards in enforcing these content moderation policies. That is exactly what the Facebook Oversight Board has been doing. I don't know how much publicity this has gotten, but starting about a year ago, Facebook had appointed a group of, I think, about a couple dozen people from all over the world. They're experts, and many are lawyers, but some are social scientists and philosophers. I mean, it's very diverse in terms of area of the world and expertise, and they take a tiny number of cases, considering the everyday in the category of hate speech alone. According to its own reports, Facebook is taking down several 100,000 posts every day. You know, one company, one category, one day. But I think that potentially the decisions of this board could have influence, and every single decision that they've made so far, where they agree to review and somebody who's objecting to having their message taken down by Facebook, they've all been based on international human rights standards. And they've decided a number of cases involving hate speech in which they've said that, that was inconsistent. It may have been consistent with Facebook's own standards to take down this speech, but it was inconsistent with international human rights standards, in part because there were less speech restrictive alternatives that would have been at least as effective, including perhaps putting a label on the material or demoting it rather than completely repressing it. Can somebody else call, because I don't want to pick and choose. My eyesight isn't that good, and I really want people to be called on fairly. Hi.
Hello. I would like to ask about the question of freedom of speech and, let's say, freedom of access to communication channels. Mm-hmm. Because in my understanding, there is a difference in freedom of speech. I can say whatever I want, I can print whatever I want, I can distribute it. I do not get punished, criminalized, anything like that. Now, does this give me any kind of right to demand that my opinion is published in a specific media, on a specific platform, etc.? How does this compare to the right of the owner of the media or the platform to be associated necessarily by having this published on their site with these things that they do not want to be associated with? Thank you so much.
So that's a perfect complement to your question and gives me an opportunity to say more, which I should have said, which is, of course you have absolutely no right to have access to a particular private sector platform, right? Whether it be a television show, such as the one where Martin and I met last night, or whether it be a magazine, or whether it be a social media platform. These are private sector platforms, and not only do they, under our Constitution, have no First Amendment right to access to the platform, right? Because the First Amendment only protects you against government suppression. But as your excellent question implied, these companies have their own First Amendment right to make the editorial decisions about which messages they're going to convey and which ones they're not going to convey, which speakers they're going to convey and which speakers they're not going to convey. So when David Kaye, whom I mentioned, the UN Special Rapporteur, and I and others are arguing that we wish the platforms would be more open, it is advocated through encouragement, not as a matter of legal obligation, making a recommendation that we think it would make sense as a public policy matter, given the practical significance of access to these platforms, if they would be open to all expression the same way government is. But I, for one, would strongly oppose any government regulation that directly imposed content moderation standards on those companies, with one exception. And this is something that only has surfaced recently in the conversation in the United States. And it's a very important exception, which is these companies are free and should be free to make their own voluntary editorial decisions as a matter of whatever their editorial policy is. But they should not be co-opted by the government to act under government duress. And what we've seen in the United States for quite a long time now is enormous pressure being brought to bear on the giant tech platforms by the President of the United States, by members of Congress, by other powerful government officials with thinly veiled threats and sometimes express threats of you better take down this disinformation about COVID, or you better take down that misinformation about the last presidential election. And if you don't do that, we're going to revoke the legislative immunity that you now have for third-party content that's posted there, or we're going to subject you to an antitrust investigation. Now, it would be completely irrational to allow government to, in effect, delegate its censorial power to a private sector entity and to do an end run around its constitutional guarantees and U.S. law, constitutional obligations. U.S. law actually recognizes that. We have this basic doctrine called the state action doctrine or the government action doctrine. The First Amendment, other constitutional guarantees only bind the government. But there is an important exception, except if what appears to be private sector action is actually being coerced, in effect, by the government. I think because of just the increased pressure that came on these social media companies after January 6th, law professors started writing articles saying, hey, we think maybe this exception is applying to the state action doctrine, and now many lawsuits have been filed that have raised that theory. So Donald Trump, probably being the most prominent example, has brought lawsuits against Twitter and Facebook for deplatforming him, and he's brought the lawsuits in the form of class actions on behalf of not only himself, but everybody else who has been deplatformed, and he's arguing that although they are private sector entities, that particular deplatforming was actually as a result of government pressure, and therefore the First Amendment applies and the First Amendment was violated. And these are very serious allegations that depend on all the facts and circumstances, and a number of courts have said that's a theory that's worth investigating. We're not going to toss these cases out of court on the state action doctrine. We're going to really examine to what extent it was voluntary and to what extent it was pressured.
I would like to ask what are our options when we are getting into this, let's say, state of the things when the censorship by the state is pretty much exercised by these private sector companies, which works as a, let's say, prolonged hand of the government, and they are even going more preemptive than the government itself.
Yes.
On those, let's say, censorship actions against the free speech.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the point that is being made by these lawsuits. And when you talk about preemptive, there's a doctrine that certainly exists in international law as well as U.S. law of prior restraint. I mean, that's considered to be the worst form of censorship because it's just stopping the message from getting out there in the first place. And it's also really important to bear in mind, people may have no love lost for the messages Donald Trump was putting up there, but freedom of speech belongs not only to the speaker, it also belongs to the audience. And I think especially in a democracy, it's really important that all of us have the right to hear, if we choose to hear information and ideas that are being purveyed by government officials. So it's not only, so it's a prior restraint on everything that would be said, I'm using Trump as the most prominent example, not only by Trump himself, but by everybody who's listening, everybody who's engaged in the Twitter threads and so forth. And it really is having a very suppressive impact. So, we have to be very attentive to the serious practical adverse impact on freedom of speech, even while recognizing, as this gentleman raised, the really important free speech rights of the platforms themselves. Let me tell you what I advocate and what other human rights and digital rights advocates advocate as the ideal, and that would be the same user empowerment, user agency, user freedom of choice that we have with respect to traditional media, and that we had online until what people are calling the platformization. Right? The idea of the internet was here is the first time in human history that virtually every single person on earth can communicate with basically every other person on earth. In the United States, the advent of the internet was greeted as the advent of all new media have been throughout history with a censorship law. That's too dangerous. It's going to give too much free speech to too many people. And so our government immediately passed a law with sweeping bipartisan majorities censoring certain controversial material on the internet. My organization went to court and in a historic landmark decision, the first time the Supreme Court evaluated the Constitution in cyberspace in a case called Reno. That was Janet Reno, the Attorney General of President Bill Clinton versus ACLU. The Supreme Court 9-0 struck down that law under the necessary least restrictive alternative analysis that I mentioned before. The rationale for the law was all this online speech is going to be harmful to minors, dangerous to children. America, with our puritanical heritage, was especially concerned about sexual expression and how dangerous that is to children. And the Supreme Court said, we'll assume for the sake of argument that minors being exposed to sexual expression online, that's harmful. We'll assume that purely for the sake of argument. Even if that is harmful, this law that suppresses sexually oriented expression online in general is not necessary, and it's certainly not the least restrictive alternative. Parents who don't want their kids to see certain material can use filtering and blocking technology on their own home computers at the user end. We don't want a centralized prior restraint approach at the provider end. And so that was the golden age of the internet, and then platformization came along, and the government centralized gatekeepers were replaced by these tech giants that are exercising the same centralized gatekeeper function. So in an ideal world, there would be many more options. Each of us could choose not only whatever social media platform we wanted to, but what's being advocated a lot now is that technology be required so that these companies would have to interoperate with filtering that could be provided by infinite number of other individuals or companies, and each of us could choose what content streams we wanted to receive or not to receive, and not to be beholden to the specific choices of these particular giant companies.
You also mentioned there is a linkage between the freedom of speech and apartheid and segregation, things like that. Now we are in difficult times of COVID. Let's say there are two big groups, one which is more advocating on the side of freedom, personal responsibility, let it be, and let everyone take care of himself. And there is the other group that is trying to push some measures to lower the level of the danger, etc., etc. The trouble here is that there are always externalities. So if one group is trying to protect themselves, they will inevitably externally impact the freedom of the others. If the free people that are asking for the freedom, they would inevitably impact on the health of the other people. There's a big discussion about this being discrimination. Some people call it the fascism, Nazism, things like that. How would you be trying to find some equilibrium in this situation? What can be taken as a measures not being considered as a discrimination or apartheid, or what could not be that?
That's an excellent question, and I can only answer at a general level, which is the same principle should apply, and in the United States law does apply, as what I've described with respect to free speech. This concept of an emergency, and it's sometimes, another way of looking at it is, we sometimes call it judicial strict scrutiny. It's another way of describing the same analysis. So any restriction on a fundamental liberty, which certainly would include privacy and freedom of movement, right? Quarantine is a direct deprivation of liberty in the most fundamental sense. Some of these measures affect religious liberty, which is also very important, freedom of association. A lot of fundamental rights are restricted by measures that are said to be justified by the public health emergency. And so the courts demand of the government, first of all, these restrictions are presumed to be unconstitutional. The burden of proof is on the government to demonstrate that the restriction is necessary and the least restrictive alternative in order to promote a countervailing public good. And the general public health is considered to be a sufficiently important countervailing public good. But the debate, the serious debate, as in all of these cases, the government can always assert sufficiently important purpose. So the rubber really hits the road, and the debate is over analyzing the particular measure, as I did with respect to hate speech censorship. Is it even effective in advancing public health? If it's effective, is it necessary? Is there a less restrictive alternative that would be as effective? So for every single measure, the courts have to go through that analysis, looking at factual information, looking at scientific opinions, and we have so much litigation in the United States over countless measures. Courts all over the country at every level have been deciding cases and coming out differently. The United States Supreme Court has weighed in a number of times, and you just have to take it measure by measure. The Supreme Court has struck down a lot of restrictions that have been advocated by public health authorities. Let me also, there's not a one size, I can't tell you, state to state, measure to measure. Some are struck down and some are upheld. I do agree in principle that that is the correct analysis. There's another set of constitutional law issues in addition to the restrictions on individual liberty that arise in our system. And forgive me, I'm not knowledgeable enough. I've read your Constitution, but I haven't studied it, so I don't know the answer to this. But in our country, there's a really serious issue as to which emergency restrictions may be carried out by the executive branch of government and which have to be carried out by the legislative branch of government. And in the immediate aftermath of the COVID pandemic, executive officials at every level, from the President of the United States to the governors of the individual states to the mayors of the cities, asserted emergency executive powers, asserting that they could bypass the normal parliamentary legislative process to impose emergency measures. And especially as time has gone on, there have been increasing challenges to, who is exercising the power, which branch of government, in addition to the details of the particular restrictions. Please.
I was wondering, because there's this strange thing when it comes to the social platform Because it seems like they're substituting the role of public squares. So we've got public squares that are held in private hands. And what do you do?
Yeah.
Because you've got a clash of two fundamental rights, right? So how do you ensure that we've got free expression at these new public squares, and at the same time, respect the right to private ownership?
I see somebody shaking his head. I'd love to have an audience member respond if you feel so inclined. I think I agree with that analysis, and the government does have an obligation in what the law often calls a traditional public forum, government-owned property that is traditionally accessible to people for purposes of sharing ideas, expressing ideas, assembling, associating. Classic examples are public parks and sidewalks and literal public squares. There, the government does have an obligation to respect the viewpoint neutrality principle, that it can impose what we call content neutral time, place, and manner regulations. So it could say in the era of COVID, we're not going to have more than a certain number of people at any given time so that we can preserve social distancing, but it could never discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. And I do think that that legal analogy does not apply to privately owned spaces because of their right to use their forum for propagating whatever ideas they want to and not whatever ideas they do not want to. But as a practical matter, they have substituted for the traditional public sphere as the place where if you do want to engage in a meaningful exchange of ideas, including an elected official or a candidate for elected office, exchanging ideas with voters or constituents for all practical purposes, this is the name of the game. And a few years ago, the United States Supreme Court said that explicitly. In an opinion, the court said, it used to be a matter of debate which spaces geographically are the most important for freedom of speech and for exchange of ideas. It is no longer debatable. The most important space by far is not only the internet in general, but social media in particular. And that's why we get to this dilemma that we've already talked about in several ways. How do we, on the one hand, protect the private editorial rights as a legal matter, but at the same time foster individual free speech opportunities as a practical reality. And here, I think I've already touched on this, but there was a new report that I just saw this morning as I opened my email from the institute that I mentioned in Denmark, and it's just the latest of several. This is a very excellent report that has proposed specifically for the EU, being very critical of some of the domestic laws, coming back to your question, Martin, that there be a voluntary, going back to your excellent point, agreement by the major social media platforms that they will, as a baseline, agree to international human rights standards. The proposal is that that would be monitored by one of the UN agencies, but that this would not be a matter of compulsion. This would be a matter of encouragement. Well, why should the social media companies do it? Well, it makes their lives easier. Certainly it makes it easier to resist pressures from authoritarian governments, or that matter, any government saying, look, you've got to adhere to our particular law. It would be easier for them to have one uniform standard, and then it becomes easier for them to say, we're not going to honor your demand to take down material that is illegal under your law because that material is protected by the international standards to which you have agreed, by the way, because you're a party to these international agreements. So I think there are a lot, that to me is a very promising, I'm sorry, I'm not even remembering who asked, oh, it's Adam who asked the question. That to me is a very promising approach. And I wanted to say something else about your question, Martin, because Justicia has done a lot of studies about how NetzDG, as the initial such law, how it has operated in practice. First of all, these laws have been replicated by something like 24 countries around the world, including some of the most repressive regimes. And the way the law works, in case you don't all know it, is that if somebody complains that a certain post is on social media is inconsistent with a domestic law, it has to be taken down within an incredibly short time, 24 hours, right? Or else the company is going to face enormous penalty, not only as a company, but also, I think it was something like 500,000 euro per incident. I mean, it's very, very high. Plus, individual executives are subject to penalty, whereas there's no countervailing pressure against overly taking down something, right? So there's no disincentive to just automatically, anybody complains about any expression, take it down. You have so much to lose if you make a wrong judgment in 24 hours, and nothing really to lose other than, a few free speech absolutists who are going to be complaining about it. It's led to enormous over-censorship, and as you can understand, the law can be and has been manipulated for all kinds of nefarious purposes. You have political axe to grind against somebody, or you have a personal axe to grind, make a complaint that something that they've posted is illegal under the German law, and it comes down. Now, one of the interesting studies that was done by Justitia compared the average amount of time that it takes a court in Germany or a court in other European or other countries that have anti-hate speech laws, how long does it take them to go through the process of assessing whether something actually is hate speech? I gave you that Canadian example. That took years before the court finally came out, with its decision. And yet these companies are being asked to make these determinations within such a short period of time. For all practical matters, if they're even going to do anything other than automatically take down, what they're doing is using algorithms and no human intervention. So the incentives are just so strongly in favor of over-censorship.
Okay, I wanted to ask if we don't take, if we don't consider these government mandatory rules, but only the rules against hate speech that are imposed by Facebook personally, isn't it just a manifestation of a free market? Like, it looks like people maybe like those platforms more, platforms that censor this hate speech and where they can share their thoughts and images without dealing with all these things they don't like, and all of the platforms like Parler or Gap or whatever were never that successful. So maybe it's just what people want.
I would certainly be in favor of a genuine free market, and there is no doubt that in my country and other countries that I've studied, there is no such free market because there is enormous government power that's being thrown around, sometimes in the form of direct regulation, sometimes in the form of threatened regulation. And it's interesting in the United States, as I think of one of the alternative social media companies that sprang up, I guess, in 2020 and was very quickly suppressed was called Parler, right? And so I'm not an economist, maybe you are and can answer this. Amazon, as I recall, used denied web hosting or services to Parler, and a lot of other companies denied them basic services. So for that reason, it became very, very difficult for them to function. And the reason I say I'm not an economist, at some point, I think even free market economists recognize that the market can be so interfered with by anti-competitive behavior on the part of various actors there. And I know that there's been a lot of antitrust investigation and activity here in Europe, and that is beginning in the United States, which we've come through several decades now of not really enforcing antitrust laws, and that's been very controversial and disputed, even among free market economists. One of the other approaches that has been suggested, and let me say this, but, you know, these problems are so complicated. It's not surprising we're getting a number of really interesting and good questions. I'd say in the United States, the serious discussion began pretty late, like last year, really, among the politicians and the general public. So there probably are dozens of bills that are pending in the United States Congress right now, all over the map, about what should be done. And economists and lawyers and political scientists and others have been studying and writing and making suggestions, and there are many, many, many different ideas that are being floated. And I think it's very interesting among the scholars that are studying these subjects, including the economists and the lawyers, most of them are saying these are ideas that are worth pursuing. But it's so complicated that we're not advocating anything at this point because there may be some adverse unintended consequences that we're not aware of, but we've got to start really seriously investigating. So one of the ideas that has been thrown out in the last, I'd say, half year, really very recent past, is the idea of treating certain tech giants as public utilities, as common carriers, as public accommodations, private companies that are vested with some public power and some public responsibility, and hence subject to special regulation because they are providing critical infrastructure. You know, like the classic examples would be electric companies, or in my country, the railroads, when the railroad infrastructure was first being laid down. And what's kind of interesting to me is that idea, only as a proposal, I don't know anybody who has reached a conclusion that this is the right way to go, but that it's a proposal that should be seriously considered, has been advocated by respected conservative economists, by respected libertarian economists and lawyers, and by respected liberals. So all across the political spectrum, that's kind of interesting. And the devil is in the details, because even if you do decide that these companies should be subject to extraordinary regulation, treated as quasi-public, which itself is very debatable, well, then exactly what regulations, right? Because the devil is in the details. I would say, you know, there's some a consensus around a proposal that, well, they should all be required to provide non-discriminatory, fair, and equal access, right? The way the water company has to do or the electric company has to do. And so that means that just as you can't be denied water or electricity because of disagreement with your ideas, the same should be true that you should not be denied access to these powerful platforms. And yeah, I'm not advocating that as conclusion, but I'm saying it. I do agree that that's an approach that bears serious consideration and examination. Oh, okay. Well, as I anticipated, you asked fantastic questions and made really excellent points that have enriched my thinking. These are, what you underscore to me is the universality of these issues that we are all grappling with despite the differences in factual circumstances and constitutions and legal systems, especially as we consider the increasing importance and potential of the social media companies. I would just urge that with all of the attention that tends, understandably but disproportionately, to be focused on the negative potential of these powerful communications platforms, that we never lose sight of the thrilling, positive, not only potential, but actually reality. I mean, all of us, and certainly many younger people, take for granted something that is unparalleled in human history, and making it possible for all of us to talk to each other, not only in this beautiful physical space, which I really treasure, but I look forward to continuing the conversation, thanks to the internet, even after I have departed from your beautiful country. So thank you so much for your time and your input. I've really learned a lot.